The average bonus for a CBC executive is $73,000. The average salary of a Canadian worker is $70,000. So that means that the CBC executives are taking more money from you in bonuses than what the average Canadian worker makes in an entire year.
Just disgusting. This is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation podcast, where we are fighting for lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. I'm Chris Sims. I'm the Alberta director out here in God's country. My good friend Franco Terrazzano, we've got him stationed out on the moon, also known as Ottawa. Franco, so you have some really fun habits. You also have some quirky habits. One of them is you like to snuggle up with the Parliamentary Budget Officer data every year around this time and project when, if ever, we are set to balance the budget. Do tell, what's going on?
Yeah, maybe I could probably spend, more time with some friends, or hitting the gym or whatever. But what I like to do this time of year is every year the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, releases its fiscal sustainability report. Okay, that's a fun enough read on its own. But what most people don't know is that they release this spreadsheet that they call supplementary data. And every year we go beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop, search through the spreadsheet and use that data to find when, if ever, the government will balance the budget in Ottawa. And this year, using the PBO's data, the feds won't balance the budget until 2040. Until 2040. Okay, so that's another decade and a half of a debt binge from the federal government. Now, Chris, you could probably remember back in 2015 when Trudeau was running for prime minister, said he'd have a couple little small, tiny, incy-bincy little deficits and then balance the budget in 2019. Well, now this data from the Parliamentary Budget Officer shows that the feds won't balance the budget until 2040 under the current status quo.
Wow. Yeah, I think they were called little itty bitty deficits, is what Prime Minister Harper, he even did the little hand motion, which was very rare for him to be that colorful. Now, Franco, I can hear some of the folks saying right now, but we had a lockdown, but we had a terrible, calamity hit our country. We can't blame him, but I think we can.
I think we can.
Yeah, so I think we can, because he said he was going to balance it by 2019. And they didn't do it. And that was before, everything hit the fan. So can you go through some of their spending habits and how it's changed and why it is that they should be held accountable for not balancing this thing?
Well, for starters, back in 2019, before the pandemic, Trudeau missed his balanced budget promise by $20 billion. So he wasn't off by a couple bucks, a couple Mars bars here or there. He was off by $20 billion back in 2019. And oh, by the way, even before the pandemic, the federal government was spending all-time highs, even after accounting for inflation and population growth. So even before the pandemic, when there was no cross-country recession, there wasn't COVID-19, the Trudeau government was spending more money than the federal government did during any single year when we were fighting the Nazis in World War II. That's number one. Number two, we're 2024 now. We're not in a pandemic. There isn't a lockdown. There is no justification for the fact that the federal government is still running a $40 billion deficit, especially after it just hiked capital gains taxes, hiked payroll taxes, hiked carbon taxes, hiked alcohol taxes, brought in a digital services tax, is bringing in a streaming tax, and they're still running a $40 billion deficit. But not just that. I mean, this government continues to prove that it has no plan to balance the budget or ability to balance the budget ever. Okay, so let me go back to the PBO data. It forecasts that the next balanced budget under the current trajectory of this government will be in 2040. But even that assumes no new spending and economic growth every single year. Okay, so what happens if we go through a big time recession? Well, the budget disaster will balloon even further. And assuming that this government isn't going to commit to new spending is like assuming that I'm only going to have one piece of pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving. It's a nice promise to make.
It's sprouting wings. There it goes. No, pigs will fly before Trudeau will stop overspending. Oh, my goodness.
But let me explain why this really matters, right? It's not just balancing the budget for balancing the budget's sake. Like one of the big reasons why this matters is that between now and that balanced budget projection in 2040, interest charges on the debt are going to cost taxpayers like $800 billion. Between now and 2040, interest charges on the debt will cost taxpayers about $800 billion. Okay.
Just a sec. Like, are you saying like 200 something less than a trillion? Are you saying
That's
billion?
exactly what I'm saying. $800 billion.
Okay.
We also use, and that's from now till then, cumulative, $800 billion. That's a cost for each Canadian of $18,000. Okay. And that's hundreds of billions of dollars that can't go to improving healthcare, that can't go to fixing the potholes in the road, that can't stay in Canadians' pockets, because that's hundreds of billions of dollars that's going to the bond fund managers on Bay Street just to pay interest charges on the federal government credit card.
Okay, so I've got a couple questions there. That kind of stunned me. I didn't realize it was that amount of money. Okay, so if it's that big and it's that awful, and if we stay on this current mine cart, it's going to sink us into this abyss of never balancing it till 2040. One, are there any adults in the room right now in Ottawa who are actually in power, like who are senior bureaucrats and or in cabinet who are taking this thing seriously? And two, okay, smart guy, your mission, whether or not you choose to accept it, is to balance the budget by like October. What would you do?
Okay, so quick answer is no, I don't think there are many adults in the room right now who are in power. Look, this government has given taxpayers every reason to believe that they couldn't care less about fiscal responsibility. I hate to say it, but I don't know, like, how else do you describe this? You know what I mean? For example, they just hiked capital gains taxes, a massive tax hike, and they're still running a $40 billion deficit this year in 2024. We're not in a pandemic. We're not, in lockdowns, and they're still running a $40 billion deficit. But now to the better part is like, look, folks, this is just a projection given the current status quo of this government. Balancing the budget would actually only require modest amount of spending restraint. Okay, if the federal government just stuck to its own spending projections from a couple budgets ago, we would have a balanced budget next year. Okay. And remember, when governments table these budgets, they don't just say what they're going to spend this year. They say what they're going to spend over the next handful of years. Well, if the Trudeau government just stuck to its own spending plan from a few budgets ago, balanced budget next year. And you know what? Nobody was criticizing the Trudeau government for having austerity budgets only a couple years ago. So as bad as it sounds, the picture that we're painting, it would just take somebody who would actually cut a modest amount of spending to finally fix the budget. And on that note, any politician who does want to fix the budget, their ability to do so will be directly tied to their ability to shrink the bureaucracy in Ottawa for two reasons. Number one, the bureaucracy has gotten out of control under the Trudeau government. Trudeau has hired 108,000 bureaucrats in less than a decade, a 42% increase. And number two, the bureaucracy now consumes more than half of the federal government's day-to-day spending. So if any politician wants to cut down the deficit and balance the budget, their ability to do so will be directly tied to their ability to shrink the bureaucracy.
I just really wanted to put a fine point on what you said there a couple of minutes ago. And that is that the Trudeau government could balance the budget if it went back to a previous forecasted Trudeau budget, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so this is not some white paper, okay, that we found in the middle desk drawer from Preston Manning that he left over, okay? This is not something, as far as we can go back to the 90s. No, this is something from a few budgets ago, and it was the Trudeau government that did these budget forecasts. What Franco's saying here is if they just went back to that, they would actually balance this thing and we could hit the brakes on this like careening debt clock, which just, you and I have spent quite a bit of time with the debt clock. You start staring at it and it just zones you out because it's going up so fast. We're at $1.2 trillion. It's wild. So on that note of trying to save money and where we can actually find savings. So you were, I don't know, am I allowed to tell people you were away a little bit? He was away for a little bit. And so you missed a little bit of the CBC fun. So it turns out the CBC, it's 18 something million dollars in their last round of bonuses. And this is what really jumped out at me, Franco. Even their friends, the so-called friends of the CBC, are mad about that. Can we move to CBC and talk about savings here, or do you want to keep going?
Why don't you just roll with it, Chris? This is the perfect time to bring in the CBC. Go ahead.
Okay. Trying to pry the PBO data out of Franco's hands is hard sometimes. Okay. So with CBC, as we know, it costs us 1.4 trillion. Sorry, 1.4 billion. Don't give them an idea. Don't give them ideas. It costs us 1.4 billion this year. That is an awful lot of money. For that amount of money, we could pay the wages of 7,000 paramedics and 7,000 carpenters this year. Full-time wages. So that's how much it's costing us. But the key that came out lately was that we have a dollar amount now on the latest round of bonuses, more than $18 million in bonuses. And let's just clarify something here. Were these the bonuses that CEO Catherine Tate was being asked about over and over again in committee, and now we got a dollar figure? Where do these ones land?
Yeah, I mean, so look, the CTF we've been highlighting all these bonuses, digging them up for years because of our CTF supporters and their support for our investigative journalist, Ryan Thorpe, who's been going through government documents showing all the bonuses that the CBC has been handing out over recent years. So last year, when we found out that the CBC handed out $15 million in bonuses in 2023, while announcing hundreds of job losses just before Christmas, members of Parliament brought CBC President Catherine Tate in front of committee. Tate was like, we don't hand out bonuses. We prefer to call them performance pay or at-risk pay. Well, they're bonuses. Everyone knows they're bonuses, including the CBC staff who sent us their own documents that called them bonuses. So that was last year's bonuses. This new $18 million in bonuses are the bonuses that the CBC is going to be paying out this year. Okay, so $18 million in bonuses this year, $15 million the year before that, $16 million the year before that. Going back to 2015, CBC's bonuses have cost taxpayers $132 million. Now, something that stands out to me from this year's round of bonuses is that the CBC has 45 executives, and they're getting more than $3 million in bonuses. Well, beep, boop, beep, boop. That means the average bonus for a CBC executive is $73,000. The average salary of a Canadian worker is $70,000. So that means that the CBC executives are taking more money from you in bonuses than what the average Canadian worker makes in an entire year.
Just disgusting. And the top executive, the CEO, Catherine Tate, she's paid an embarrassing amount of money. It's between $400 and something thousand and upwards to $600-ish something $1,000. What really jumps out at me, and again, this is for journalists who are listening to this and who are now keying into this CBC bonus story, please cover this. Catherine Tate is CEO level 7 under the Crown Corporation Guide. That means that she's entitled to a bonus of up to 28%. So that's enough bonus money to choke a horse. What I found really interesting this time around were two things, Franco. One, the CBC is a waste of money and these bonuses are wrong kind of narrative, that broke through into mainstream media. Usually it would just be folks in alternative media or our own supporters who were interested in this. But no, we were doing interviews about this in like downtown mainstream radio stations in most major cities. I found that very interesting. From what I would call sympathetic reporters saying, okay, well, we like the CBC, but these bonuses are outrageous. So I found that neat. Two, We got our hands on one of the emails that was sent out from this group called Friends of Canadian Media. I think they used to be called Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. Did you want to explain that one?
No, go ahead. I know you want to. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, it's okay. So this is a group, as background, it's a group that's been around for a long time. They were the ones on Parliament Hill around 10 years ago, you might remember, who were making fun of people who wanted to defund the CBC, saying if you did that, that the CBC would just be run by a bunch of idiots in professional wrestling. Right? It was kind of implied that you'd be kind of dumb to watch professional wrestling. And wouldn't this be terrible? Lots of pearl clutching going on there.
Their viewership might actually go up that way.
It's funny. Bret Hart, who is a legend here in Alberta, and of course a professional wrestler, that's exactly what he said. Because my old boss phoned them up and said, hey, what do you think about this? He said, oh, CBC might actually be run well and might get some viewership. So now fast forward a decade, they are now called something like Friends of Canadian Media. The reason why we're telling you this is that usually we wouldn't be able to agree with them on toast or what to have for lunch, okay? But, you know, the stars aligned and they put out an email to their supporters saying that these bonuses are unbecoming, unbefitting a national broadcaster and shouldn't have happened. Well, the trumpets are sounding. The CTF agrees with this group. So it's really neat that even a major advocacy organization that defends the CBC all the time, they're constant cheerleaders, they say these bonuses are out of line.
Well, and not just them and not just us. As you can tell, it seems like Canadians of all different political affiliations or political ideologies or what have you all kind of agree that it's time to put an end to these taxpayer-funded bonuses. Now, of course, the CBC makes you pay for their bonuses, but the CBC has never asked you or any other Canadian if you support their bonuses. So we decided to ask Canadians. We commissioned a Leger poll, a national reputable polling firm, to ask Canadians what they think of these CBC bonuses. And 7 in 10 Canadians oppose the CBC bonuses. 7 in 10 Canadians. When you talk about political polls, that is a huge margin. Okay, when you remove the undecideds, 81% of Canadians oppose CBC bonuses. So I'm over here starting to think like the only people who actually support the CBC bonuses are the CBC fat cats and their families. Okay, so like Canadians are like, end these taxpayer funded bonuses at the CBC, the $18 million in bonuses this year, the $132 million in CBC bonuses going back to 2015. Now, Canadians were united and the taxpayer-funded bonuses, okay? Now, here's the problem. The CBC are essentially saying, well, like, our hands are tied. Our hands are tied. And then you have the politicians, right, in cabinet, in the Liberal government, who are essentially saying, well, our hands are tied. It's up to the CBC. So the real problem here is that nobody's actually stepping in. And it's clear that Catherine Tate, the president of the CBC, it's clear she doesn't want to do the right thing and end the gravy train at the state broadcaster. So now it's time for either the heritage minister who oversees the CBC, Pascal St-Onge, or the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, or Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. They must step in and end these bonuses, or better yet, defund the Canadian Bonus Corporation.
I think that's a good new name for the CBC. That's really good. Okay, did you want to get into the other fun that you had this week? You were talking about gas taxes this week, right in downtown Ottawa. And this is another thing, if I can just give a little bit of inside baseball. I find that mainstream media interest in gas taxes, it's usually generally high-ish, but it can have peaks and valleys. But man, I feel like it peaked a lot this year. There was a lot of general and media interest in how much we're paying at the pump in gas taxes, in fuel taxes. I think that's because so many people are really strapped. Like, people call it affordability. Frankly, that means people can't pay for stuff. They can't afford food. They can't afford rent. It's brutal for a lot of families. And I think those people are phoning news stations more often and saying, hey, what the heck? And so I think that has got a really renewed interest in how much we're getting gouged at the gas station, Franco.
Yeah, that or either the price of avocado toast is just skyrocketing, right? I'm not sure.
Right.
It's either one, but yeah. So, folks, we've been doing what we call gas tax honesty now for 26 years, and the reason we do that is because, like, that you're paying the sales tax when you're at the pumps because you see it on the receipt. But like, depending on the province that you live in, you are also paying a federal fuel tax, a provincial fuel tax, federal carbon tax, federal second carbon tax. In some cities, you're paying a transit tax even when you're fueling up. And then for the federal government and all 6 provinces east of Manitoba, they're also charging their sales tax on top of those taxes. So they tax your fuel, then they tax those taxes. It's called the tax on tax. Anyways, this year, we did Gas Tax Honesty Month. So all of August, myself here in Ottawa, Chris in Alberta, and our provincial colleagues across Canada have been doing press conferences to sound the alarm on, like, hey, folks, the tax bill is making the price of pump extremely expensive. Taxes can account for up to 45% of the pump price in Canada, the highest being there in Vancouver. Okay, but like, So we were doing this. We had a lot of success in terms of how much media coverage we were getting, including yesterday, or people don't know when we're filming this, but the end of August here is when we had our press conference in Ottawa. And one of the things that I was trying to highlight is the tax on tax. Right? Because the GST on the carbon tax alone will cost Canadians $600 million this year and more than $1 billion annually by 2030. And you know what, folks? You hear the Trudeau government spinner saying, don't worry about the carbon tax. You get more money in rebates, blah, 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 blah. But that tax on tax money, none of that is rebated back to you Canadians. So that is more proof that the carbon tax does not make you better off. It costs you big time.
So I've been saying millions. I should be saying hundreds of millions that the GST costs you as a tax on tax just on the carbon tax.
On the carbon tax alone, it's $600 million this year. By the end of 2030, the GST on the carbon tax will have cost taxpayers $6.2 billion.
Oh, goodness. That is just astonishing. And see, this is where I think people can kind of lose track of it because they're just getting gouged everywhere they go. It always feels like half their wages are going up in smoke. There was a gentleman online who a few months ago basically said something like, okay, close your eyes. Imagine what gets deposited into your bank account or what you get in your check, double it. What could you do with that kind of money? Could you get better food for your kids? Could you save for a down payment? Could you get better education for your family? That's generally how much the governments, various levels of governments, are taking from you. And I think that the fuel taxes are a really good way of showing that because there's different levels of government, especially if you're looking at municipal, provincial, and federal in places like Vancouver, where they've all got their hand in your pocket and it makes everything cost more. It costs seniors more to drive to the doctor's office. It costs parents more to drop their kids off at school. All the shipping costs from the stuff that we need to eat and use. Do you think that message is sinking in, that it's at the fuel pumps quite often where we're getting soaked the most?
Well, we're certainly getting soaked, right? I mean, governments love to reach into your pocket, it seems like, with every activity of life nowadays. But certainly the gas pumps is one of the big ways where they make your life more expensive and take more of your money. So let me just break down some of the numbers. So on average, right, it all depends because different provincial governments have different fuel taxes. Even some cities have transit taxes at the pump. So it all depends. But on average, taxes make up about 60 cents per liter of the price of gas, right? 60 cents a liter. So if you're fueling up your minivan, gas taxes are costing you about $45 every fuel up. Okay. And the federal gas taxes make up a huge chunk of that overall tax bill. Federal gas taxes alone cost 35 cents a liter. And that tax bill is going up because of Trudeau's carbon tax hikes that he has coming down the road. So in 2030, federal gas taxes will cost 74 cents a liter of gas. Federal gas taxes alone, 74 cents a liter of gas in 2030, which means that family fueling up their Dodge Caravan or minivan or whatever, $56 in federal gas taxes alone in 2030.
That's astonishing. Even what it is right now, around $45 is taxes on that minivan. Like, folks, picture what that is every fill up. That's not just one time or an annual fee. Every time you're filling up that family minivan, it's around $45 in taxes. Like, I could cook an entire Christmas dinner for $45. That is food off of your table. It's astonishing. I really hope that there is some light at the end of this tunnel, that we will eventually see some of those fuel taxes come back down. In the meantime, folks, make sure you're reaching out to your MLAs, your member of parliament, and go to city hall meetings. Raise a stink about this. Tell them that you're sick and tired of being taxed and tapped out at the pumps. Did we want to get to our taxpayer pro tip?
Yeah, and I'll start because mine's on this. So we also commissioned another Leger poll to ask Canadians what they think about the carbon tax on tax. 62% of Canadians said scrap the carbon tax on tax. 62%. Okay. Remove the undecideds. 74% of Canadians said scrap the carbon tax on tax. So the poll, crystal clear, the vast majority of Canadians want the government to scrap the carbon tax on tax to make life more affordable. So my taxpayer pro tip, two things. Number one, to our supporters. Anyone who tells you that little magical myth that the carbon tax rebates make you better off, you say this or something to this effect. The government also charges its sales tax on top of the carbon tax, costing us $600 million this year, and none of that tax on tax money is rebated back. So baloney. Baloney. I'd like to say another word, but it's a family show, so baloney.
It's a family show.
But the second taxpayer pro tip goes out to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Look, I'm not naive. I'm pretty sure, and I hope to be proven wrong, that Trudeau will never do the right thing and scrap his carbon tax. But he could at least end this tax on tax like the vast majority of Canadians want him to. And with him nosediving in the polls, he's probably looking for some way to show he's doing something about affordability. And one of the ways that he can do that, at the very least, is end this tax on tax at the gas pumps.
He should take it. I just encourage him and his team, take it. You've been borrowing platform ideas from other people. Just take it. This one is gift wrapped for you. And we have seen some movement. I don't know if they followed through on it. We have seen some movement on GST on certain items being removed over the last year or so, if I can recall correctly. Yep. So maybe they'd be willing to go that route. And then they're not climbing out of their carbon tax tree that they've decided to build a hut in. But they can at least climb down on this GST element of it and save people $600 million this year. That's an awful lot of money. Speaking of an awful lot of money, my taxpayer pro tip brings us back home here to Alberta. And Alberta just released its first quarterly fiscal update. What that means is a few times a year, the finance minister and the finance department of Alberta gives an update. It's basically like a little mini baby budget. And that's where they update their numbers. So generally good news-ish. Generally, we have got an accounting surplus, as the finance minister calls it, and it is improved up to more than $2 billion. And if folks remember, back in February, their surplus was so thin you could see through it. It was like $367 million with an M. In a budget worth $70 billion, that's as thin as a baby kitten whisker. So good to see that it's up over $2 billion. But though, there's a catch. The debt's going up. They've piled around $4 billion more onto the provincial debt. Now, they've got a lot of reasons for saying that. They say it's mostly in the capital spending column, and they're doing it now and borrowing money now because it's at a better rate, yada, yada, yada. But this is cause for concern. Yellow light, yellow flag. They have got to be careful about not piling money onto that debt, because this is how provincial governments get into financial trouble. Now, the one little bit of good news concerning the debt is that our debt interest payments have gone down. We are now spending less as taxpayers on debt servicing costs, as they call it, debt interest payments, around $100 million or so and change. So that's at least savings in the bank. So just wanted to give a little caution yellow light there on the Alberta government's fiscal update. They sounded very cautious too, Franco. I don't know if you caught some of Horner's tone, but they sounded pretty cautious about it as well. So the good news is there's a surplus. The concerning element is the debt is going up. Midway good news also, though, is that they're putting money into the Heritage Fund. So, folks, if you want more details on this, if you want your little mini baby budget analysis, or if you want to find out exactly how much the CBC executives are getting paid in bonuses, or what we're paying in gas taxes, we've got a full report on gas taxes, every area of Canada. Head on over to our website, taxpayer.com, sign the petitions that matter to you, and join the fight for lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government.